I want to welcome everybody in. We will be getting started in just a minute. Welcome to the Alumni Association's virtual speaker series. We are so glad to have so many people participating today in a session presented by Friederike Baer. She's going to be talking about Hessians, German soldiers in the American Revolutionary War. Go ahead and let us know who you are and where you're zooming in from today. You can do that by using the chat in the bottom of your Zoom video window. We'd love to welcome you in personally. I see Andrea from New York City. Welcome, Andrea. And Tom Hess from right here in State College. Good to see you, Tom, and Bill Gerber from York, and Lori Hahn right here at University Park as well. I see Dan tuning in from Annapolis, Maryland, Scott Phillips all the way from Dresden, Germany, Peter Sheridan from Reading, Bruce Porter from San Jose, California. Thank you all so much for zooming in. Shout out to Barbara and Frackville down there in Schuylkill County. Good to see so many people zooming in here. Annette from State College and Barb from Longboat Keys, Florida. We will be getting started here in just a minute. Thanks for zooming in with us for today's virtual speaker session presented by the Penn State Alumni Association. See Rob from Berks County and Glenn from Philadelphia, Frank from Tampa, Peg from Narvon, Pennsylvania. Good to see everybody in here today. Liz from Johnstown, welcome. We're getting started in just a moment. Where else would you rather be than a Zoom full of Penn Staters? Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Paul Clifford, CEO of the Penn State Alumni Association, and I'd like to welcome everybody to today's virtual speaker session titled Hessians, German Soldiers in the American Revolutionary War. Live closed captions are available. You can access them by clicking the closed caption button at the bottom of your Zoom video window and then clicking Show Subtitle. You may also customize your caption view by clicking the Stream to Text link in the chat. We are live streaming today's presentation, which will also be archived and available on our website. Today's discussion takes us back to the 18th century. Between 1776 and 1783, Great Britain hired more than 30,000 German soldiers to fight in its war against the American rebels. Collectively known as Hessians, these soldiers and accompanying civilians, including hundreds of women and children, spent extended periods of time in locations as dispersed and varied as Canada in the north and west and Florida in the south. This presentation highlights key experiences of these participants in a war on a distant continent against the people that had done them no harm. Today's presenter is Dr. Friederike Baer. She is an associate professor of history and division head for arts and humanities at Penn State Abington. Originally from Germany, she holds a PhD in early American history from Brown University, and her research focuses on the experiences of German-speaking people in North America in the periods of the War for American Independence and early Republic. She is the author of The Trial of Frederick Eberly, Language, Patriotism, and Citizenship in Philadelphia's German Community, 1790 to 1830. And her most recent publication is the topic of today's discussion, Hessians, German Soldiers in the American Revolutionary War, for which she was awarded the 2023 Society of Cincinnati Book Prize. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Baer.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you for inviting me to share my research about the German soldiers in the Revolutionary War with the Penn State Alumni Association. I will share my screen. So give me 1 second. And does that look good?
Looks perfect.
Okay, great.
All right, have fun.
Thank you. All right, so welcome everyone joining from far and wide. I think the time of day makes it possible also from people to join from other time zones, faraway time zones. And I saw there are a couple of people from Germany. So it's really wonderful to see you all here in this virtual space. So my presentation, again, yes, it focuses on the German soldiers in the American Revolutionary War. And I would like to start with a kind of a general introduction, an overview, who these people were, these individuals that we know as Hessians, how they ended up in North America. And then I would like to focus on a couple of experiences that highlight the variety really of their backgrounds and their fates here in this North American war. So, introduction. Between 1776 and 1783, Paul already mentioned this, the British hired approximately 30,000 German soldiers in the war against the American rebels. I want to emphasize that they made up a significant proportion of the British military force. We estimate that by around 1780, 1781, in other words, 4 to 5 years into the war, fully one third of the British regular army strength in North America consisted of German auxiliaries. So this was obviously not an insignificant presence. It is also important to mention that Britain's employment of foreign soldiers was nothing unusual at the time. Britain fought most of its 17th and all of its major 18th century wars with the help of foreign auxiliaries. And Britain was not unique in this regard. Other major European powers, like France, for example, Prussia, Russia, the United Provinces of the Netherlands, all employed foreign troops at one time or another. The typical European army was a multinational force. In addition, the quote-unquote trade in soldiers, as it is sometimes called, was an acceptable form of revenue. Rulers rented out soldiers to foreign powers for subsidy payments, and they used the income to support lavish lifestyles, which earned them the criticism of selling their subjects, like, and I quote, cattle to have their throats cut, as the King of Prussia put it in a letter to the French philosopher Voltaire in 1776. But they also used the income to pay off territorial debts, and in fact, even the King of Prussia was in favor of the practice if that was the main purpose. And they used it to fund projects that were designed to benefit the territory generally, such as the construction of villages, roads, hospitals, and the like. One of the most famous of these projects was the spa that was constructed in Hanau, Hessen-Hanau. Construction began in 1777, and the project was pretty much funded with subsidy payments that the ruler received for renting out his troops to Britain. Thomas Jefferson himself visited the spa in 1788 in the company of Friedrich Wilhelm von Geismar, a Hanau officer who had befriended him during his stay in Virginia when Geismar was a prisoner of war. He had become a prisoner as a result of Burgoyne's surrender at Saratoga. He was a member of what we know as the Convention Army. Jefferson admired the impressive spa that had been built with money paid for soldiers hired out to fight against the American revolutionaries. In addition, subsidy treaties should also be seen as political measures that allowed the rulers of smaller territories within the Holy Roman Empire to maintain a certain degree of power, and in some cases also preserve their dynastic interests and gain protection from foreign threats. And finally, last but not least, these soldiers were not mercenaries, which are soldiers who fight in the foreign army or war for personal profit. We have to remember that these were military units with their own commanders that were hired out by their respective rulers to, in this case, to assist Britain in its efforts to put down the American rebellion. A better term for these Better than mercenary would be subsidy troops or auxiliary troops. I probably don't have to remind anyone here that Germany as a nation did not exist in the late 18th century. So the territories that ended up renting out their or hiring out their subjects to Britain all belonged to the Holy Roman Empire, which was made up of several hundreds territories ranging from city-states to larger duchies, landgraviates, and so forth. So how did these Germans end up in the war in America? Well, in the spring of 75, Britain faced a very challenging task, and that was to raise a substantial army quickly that could be dispatched to America, hopefully for the next campaign. For various reasons, the king determined that he would not be able to raise a sufficient number of troops at home or within the empire, the British Empire, including, of course, North America. After the failure of his efforts to raise or to hire 20,000 Russians, the king turned to several German states for support, as he had done many times before. And in fact, by the summer of 1775, several of the German rulers had already reached out to king, offering his subjects for hire. In the end, 6 German territories hired out troops for substantial subsidy payments, and they're indicated here on this map. The original treaties, the first treaties, were formally concluded in January of 76, and then we have additional treaties over the next several years. The number that I'm indicated here on the slide under the territories' names indicates what we estimate is the total number of troops that were sent into the North American War between 76 and 83. So, for example, the territory of Waldeck rented out initially. The treaty called for 1 regiment, roughly 670 men. But if you add replacements and reinforcements, the total number of Waldeckers was actually closer to 1,200 individuals. Because the majority of the soldiers, and you can see this here, Hessen-Hanau and Hessen-Kassel, were supplied by these 2 territories, the label Hessian has been used since the 1770s to describe all German troops in British service in North America, regardless of place of origin. However, the subsidy troops and the affiliated civilians never described themselves as Hessians unless they were actually from Hessen or belonged to a Hessian military unit. So a member of the Braunschweig Corps, for example, or of the Waldeck Regiment would have never described himself as a Hessian. I think that's important to keep in mind. So I mentioned the treaties were formally agreed, the first treaties in January of 1776. The slide here shows printed copies of the treaties with Hessen-Kassel, Braunschweig, and Hessen-Hanau. They were published in German-speaking Europe right away in 1776 in German and in English. The original treaties, for the most part, were actually written in French. And I just want to say a few general words about these kind of agreements. They're varied somewhat in the details, but they're basically all agreed on essential points. The German units would be commanded by their own officers, and they would be subject to their own military law. The German troops would serve on the same terms as British soldiers, which included individual pay, which was quite generous by German standards. They could only serve in Europe and in North America. Britain paid in return for these troops annual subsidy payments to the ruler during the time they were in British service, and also usually a couple of years after the conclusion of the war. And of course, when these treaties were signed in January of 76, no one knew how long that war would last. Britain would also pay for transport to and from America. It would cover individual pay, most but not all of the equipment, provisions, replacements, medical care. As you can probably imagine, keeping track of all of this was quite challenging, and it got more and more complicated over the course of the war. In America, the Germans ended up always serving alongside British troops with a couple of exceptions. And also with very few, very rare exceptions, the overall commander of these troops was always a British officer. The military units were accompanied by hundreds of civilian employees, including medical personnel, chaplains, servants, and laborers. And to the army also belonged a significant number of women, including single women and wives of soldiers who served in a range of very important roles, such as laundresses or maids who were employed in the field hospitals. The presence and the role of women and also children is not as well documented as one would wish, but they do show up in the records. And here on my slide is an example of an embarkation list or a list of passengers on a vessel going from Braunschweig or from Germany, Stade in Germany, to Quebec, that serves as evidence that the troops were accompanied by women and children. Don't want to go over this in great detail, but I do want to point out that obviously when the ship left Stade in April of 1779, Stade is a port in Germany. Many transports left from there for England, and then from England they went to North America. 14 women were on board the vessel, and 2 children were on board the vessel. When the ship arrived in Quebec in the fall of 1779, there are only 13 women on board the vessel. Turns out that one of them had been chased away from the regiment along with her husband. We don't exactly know why, but the notes indicate that they had done something that warranted punishment, chasing away from the regiment. We also know that 2 children, again, were on the vessel when the ship departed from Germany. 2 vessels are on the ship when it was in Quebec, but it's not the same 2 children. One of these children had died during the voyage, and another one had been born during the transatlantic crossing. On this document on the right, we have a number of individuals who were listed as sick, and then we also have several individuals, men and this child, who died during the voyage. We have one individual, the company surgeon, who actually deserted, probably in Europe before the ship ever left England. So, as I mentioned, documents like this serve as evidence for women and children who left Germany and went to North America with the Corps, which, by the way, was not unusual. 18th century armies, and this is also true for the American Army, really, I think, should be seen as communities that include men, women, and children. But when I see this kind of document, and there are lots of this type of document, I also see a lot of different stories. These are individuals who joined the Corps or attached themselves to the Corps for different reasons. They had very different experiences, they have different motivations, and ultimately their stories are extremely varied. And that's really, when I set out to research my book, that's really what I was interested in. So as I mentioned, the first treaties were signed in early 76. The rulers, the respective rulers of these territories, had literally only a few weeks to assemble and outfit substantial corps. Hessen-Kassel, for example, the original treaty called for 12,000 troops. That's a large number that needed to be assembled, outfitted, put on transports, sent to England, and then from there to North America in a matter of weeks. It was relatively easy to fill the officer corps. There were plenty of men who sought to advance their careers, veterans who hoped to, for employment, appointments in these new regiments. That was not the challenge. It was challenging, however, to fill the corps. What we should not imagine is that these rulers, these 6 rulers, had standing armies kind of ready to go. All of them had to recruit a significant number of men specifically for service in America. They used a variety of conscription schemes. Don't need to go, I think, into the details, but I think we can generally say that they were basically looking for the same type of men. The men, of course, had to be physically and mentally fit to withstand a military campaign in America. The age age mattered. It turns out that most German soldiers were in their 20s, but we have soldiers or members of the Corps that were basically teenagers. And we also have some soldiers that were in the 50s or even in the 60s. There should be at least 5'4" tall. That requirement was relaxed over the course of the war as it became increasingly challenging to fill the needs, to meet the need for new men. And then ideally they were single and if married without children, in other words, without dependents. On the slide here, you see a recruiting certificate for a Braunschweig soldier. And I just want to mention that this man received a bounty of 5 thaler. Just to put this into context, the typical servant's wages at the time were probably around 1 to 1.5 thaler a month. So 5 thaler is quite generous, and it's clearly designed as an incentive for men to sign up. I also want to point out the date of this particular certificate, February 1782. I think we tend to think of the German soldiers, they're raised in 1776, and that is the massive troop transport, of course, to North America during that year. But recruitment of German soldiers continued pretty much until the end of the war. As many of you know, February 1782, that's after Yorktown, which happened in the fall of 1781, which is often considered kind of the end of the war. At least it is the last major battle. But that did not mean that Britain was no longer interested in sending German troops to North America. So we know that we have transports in 82 that included several thousand German troops from all of the territories. All of these territories also used various exemptions that were designed to exclude men from military service. For example, only sons, property owners, laborers in essential industries like mining, for example. These individuals were not supposed to go into service in America. Generally, recruiters were supposed to enlist foreigners or native men deemed expendable. In other words, men whose departure for America was regarded as having little or no economic disadvantages for the territory, or whose absence may have even been seen as beneficial for the local community. And I'll give you a couple of examples. In February 1781, Katharina Maria Hosbach, who was from Hessen, pleaded with the Landgraf to send her husband Johannes to America. She was a widow with 4 daughters and had married him on the advice of others, she wrote, and it had initially gone quite well. But then he had started to behave badly. He had not pursued his profession, and he had not contributed anything to the household while demanding her to prepare fancy meals and drink for him. Katharina was the proprietor of a tavern, but his bad behavior, she said, discouraged people from lodging with her. He was a danger, in addition to all these other issues, to her 4 daughters, and he never went to church. In short, she asked her ruler to have him sent to America in order to, and I quote, improve him and lead him to a better lifestyle. To her disappointment, the request was actually rejected. Their neighbors testified not only that the wife was in part to blame for the domestic troubles, but also that he was the only wig maker in town. He was important to the community. In early 1782, a widow in Hanau had more luck of having her son sent to America, largely because her neighbors agreed that he was a danger to the community. She pleaded with Hanau's ruler to enlist her son, 24-year-old Georg Christian Vogt, in the Free Corps that was scheduled to go to America that spring. She was a poor widow, she said, and she claimed that he was a violent man who had attacked her with an axe during an argument. Investigation revealed that he had also stolen tobacco from a field and burglarized several homes. He often came home drunk, neighbors testified, and wandered around the attic with a burning candle. Very dangerous scenario. The mother in the testimony described him as, the German word is a Taugenichts, good for nothing, who had already received all sorts of punishments without improving his ways. Sending him to America would not only help her, but it would also benefit the community and hopefully straighten him out. The son, not surprisingly, rejected these accusations of bad behavior. He admitted that he had been angry, but he said he had never intended to hit or to even kill his mother. She called him a good for nothing. He, in his own statement, called her a Seelenverkäufer, or a seller of souls. To make a long story short, in the records, we find that Georg was ordered to go to America. I have actually not been able to confirm definitively whether he made it. Ideally, of course, men volunteered, but it was challenging to meet the need with volunteers alone. Files in German archives document cases of young men who refused to report for mustering. Maybe Georg just refused to show up. Potential recruits who escaped into foreign territories, recruits who deserted or even mutinied, and families who pleaded with their ruler to exempt husbands or sons for a variety of reasons. The main objection of men to serve in these regiments appears to have been the prospect of serving in a foreign war on a distant continent against an enemy that had done them no harm. As mentioned earlier, Britain had hired German auxiliaries on multiple occasions. However, until 1776, they had never served outside of Europe. And as a result, local officials struggled to recruit suitable men. At the same time, not surprisingly, I think, there were also reasons why a man from the Holy Roman Empire may have volunteered for service in America. Recruits went willingly, or they volunteered for an opportunity to improve their economic situation. In some cases, gained free passage to America, to advance their military career, to study the American land and the people, or escape challenging circumstances. The German poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe recalled in 1821 that in 1775, quote, America used to be the El Dorado of people who found themselves in the difficult situation. Some men undoubtedly went in search of adventure. 22-year-old recruit Stefan Popp, for example, he was from Ansbach, Bayreuth, recorded in his journal that many of the recruits around him were, quote, filled with grief and sorrow, while I, and those in my way of thinking, were enjoying the prospect of leaving our mother country for the new world. In short, the people that we lumped together as Hessians were a very diverse group of individuals of different backgrounds and with a wide range of motivations and expectations. Ultimately, the German troops ended up widely dispersed along the eastern seaboard in North America, from Canada, including Quebec and Nova Scotia, to West Florida and even Cuba. And they participated in every major campaign and countless minor military encounters. I'm emphasizing this because when we think of Hessians, we tend to associate them with Trenton, the American defeat of the Hessian garrison on Christmas 1776. We also associate them with Saratoga, also an American victory in the fall of 1777. And then finally, of course, Yorktown, the major American victory in the fall of 1781. And it is true that thousands of German troops took part in these three significant events. But the majority of Germans did not. Their experiences were quite different. So I think we have to remember that, the variety of experience over the course of several years in North America. We are very fortunate to have a huge body of records that were penned by members of the German Corps during this war between 1776 and 1783, the time that German troops were in North America. And the slide here just gives you a small example of the material that is available and that I used for my research for my book. I visited approximately 24 archives in Europe and also in North America. And when I set out on this project, I did actually not realize how much material we have, which is wonderful, but also a little overwhelming. So my examples here include private correspondence, that's in the top left, a letter written by a soldier, I'll actually refer to this in a minute, from Quebec. The cover, the envelope is addressed in French, the letter is in German. And then in the middle, top middle, we have a list of a regiment from Bühnow that served in various places, including in Rhode Island. We have lots of lists of people and stuff. I think one way to look at this is look at the soldier as kind of a commodity that was hired out, that was paid for. Record keeping was for various reasons, including because it was a financial transaction, very important. So we have lots of lists like this. The top right is a baptismal record that was created after the war. This record, and I'll refer to that in a little bit later today as well, documents the baptism of 5 Black drummers who were hired in or recruited in North America and returned with the Corps to Germany. Bottom right is a printed account of the journey of a regiment from New York to Pensacola. This is an example of a record that was published during the war for a German-speaking audience in Europe. Interest was intense. People really wanted to know what is happening in North America, what is happening to these troops. And there are some individuals, including this particular officer, his name was Heldring, who sent an account back to Germany. It was printed and published while the war was still going on. The center document is a regimental journal. We have lots of regimental journals. The commander, the second major commander of the Hessian Corps, his name is Wilhelm von Knüpphausen, fairly early on in the war, instructed all quartermasters on behalf of the Landgraf to keep detailed records of the regiments, to record each and every event that happened to this regiment. And as a result of that, we have these regimental journals, which are in there, most of which are in a depository in Kassel. And then bottom left is a diary by a soldier, an Ansbach Bayreuth soldier. So it's a variety of material. We also have lots of maps. We have objects that were brought back from North America. And I think that these records helped broaden the understanding of North America and the war and the people amongst German-speaking Europeans in the late 18th century. And they're certainly, I think, enrich our own understanding of the war and what happened today. Ideally, of course, initially, so let me go to North America now. Initially, the Germans did not have much respect for the Americans as a worthy enemy. Of course, as I mentioned, many of the German soldiers were young men who had been recruited specifically for the war in America. They were not necessarily more experienced in warfare than their American counterparts. Certainly, most of them had never participated in a battle before. However, from the perspective of someone belonging to a highly hierarchical and disciplined army that stressed the neat and orderly appearance of all its members, from private to general, the Americans didn't even look like soldiers. For example, German soldiers were either clean-shaven or they wore neatly groomed mustache. Many of the Americans appeared to be unshaven, thus giving them the appearance of, the German term is they used as Spitzbuben or scoundrels rather than soldiers. Shortly after his arrival on Long Island, a Hessian wrote in a letter to Kassel that he did not have a razor. He was embarrassed that at times he had, and I quote, a beard like a rebel. Moreover, the Hessian troops, well uniformed, at least during the early phase of the war, found that many Americans were dressed in, quote, torn rags of different colors, or the miserable outfits typically worn by poor farmers. For the most part, moreover, they found that American soldiers were undisciplined and lacked loyalty. They were cowards who ran away at the first sight of the enemy. From the Germans' perspective, Washington's retreats in the fall of 1776, his refusal to meet the British in a large-scale battle, were not based on strategic decisions, rather they were due to the spinelessness of his soldiers. For example, according to the Hessian chaplain Becker, the Hessians were charging, as he put it, after the countless bands of gypsies, as he described the American troops. And at the Battle of Harlem Heights in the fall of '76, the American Colonel Joseph Reed was enraged when British and Hessians, and I quote, sounded their bugles in a most insulting manner, as is usual after a fox chase. It took the Germans a while to abandon their preconceived notions about the proper appearance and behavior of an army. And indeed, the Germans realized early on that the American war was unlike any other military conflict they had known. First, of course, there was the terrain and the climate. The troops in Canada, for example, had to adjust to long, cold winters, snow and ice. They had to learn how to navigate the many waterways, many with treacherous rapids. They had to learn how to row boats and how to march in snowshoes. More about this in a moment. The terrain and climate in places such as West Florida and Georgia required different kinds of adjustments, such as dealing with the heat and the humidity and the mosquitoes. Regardless of location, German troops frequently throughout the war complained about physically exhausting marches and rough terrain and inclement weather that they were not used to and that rendered campaigning exceptionally challenging. Second, of course, they had to get used to an American way of fighting. For example, they had trouble distinguishing between friend and foe, between rebel and loyalist. And the distinction between civilian and combatants was also often unclear to them. And moreover, the Americans tended to fight in what the Germans described as very unconventional ways. This included their strategy of ambushing an unsuspecting enemy. In 1777, a private wrote that to his parents in Hessen that the Americans were not like soldiers, like regular soldiers, but rather, and I quote, more like robbers and thieves, in that they hide in hedges and bushes and shoot so well when they are able that they hit every time. Although this behavior was seen as dishonorable, even unacceptable, it also rendered these fighters into effective opponents. German troops had to get used to this kind of irregular warfare, carried out by what they saw as a ragtag bunch of farmers, how to protect themselves from ambushes, but also how to conduct them. In the meantime, the American image of the Hessian soldiers was ambivalent. On the one hand, they were depicted as ruthless mercenary, as a plunderer, a savage, not unlike Native Americans. He was brutal toward both enemy soldiers and worse, innocent civilians, including women and children. This image prevailed during the summer and fall of 1776, as the Patriots tried to motivate American men to join the rebellion and defend their communities, their homes, their families from these invaders. In broadsides, newspaper accounts, and in private correspondence, the Hessian was consistently depicted as violent and merciless. And I believe that this image prevails to some extent to this day. But on the other hand, the Hessian was also depicted as a poor victim of tyranny, forced by greedy princes to fight in a war that did not concern him. He was deserving of pity, based on the assumption that these soldiers had been enlisted against their will and that they lacked loyalty to the British cause. The Americans believed that they would gladly lay down their weapons and settle in America if only given the chance. And in fact, the Patriots began to publish offers of liberty and property as early as the summer of 1776. And here's an example, the earliest known broadside that was published in German in North America that offered foreign troops to put down their arms, who basically chose military service under a tyrant to liberty in America, offered liberty, religious freedom in particular, and in this case, 50 acres of land. These kind of offers were repeated over the course of the war. Of course, the capture of as many as 1,000 Hessians at Trenton, Christmas 1776, reinforced the image of these German soldiers as innocent victims, and the patriots actively cultivated that image over the next few years. I would like to use the remainder of my time to share a few experiences of members of the German Corps as a way to highlight the variety of their stories. The first one is a private letter written by Braunschweig Lieutenant August Duroy, who was in Canada in May 1781. The letter is addressed to his brother in Braunschweig. When Duroy sat down to pen this letter, he had been in America for 5 long years. He was one of around 5,000 Germans that were stationed in Canada at that time. Although they were in a loyal province, they were quite suspicious of the local sentiments, and they tended to feel like an occupying force. The fact that most of the inhabitants were French-speaking and Catholic probably contributed to a sense of alienation. In this particular letter, Duroy covered a wide range of topics. We have several letters by him, all quite detailed. First, he was glad that his regiment had recently been moved to a post where he thinks it would be of better use. He doubts, by the way, that the Americans would dare another attack on Canada after the disastrous attempt in late 1775. But of course, he cannot be sure. We know now that the Americans did not attack and that the troops did not participate in any battles after this time. But the troops that were stationed there did not know that at the time. They remained on high alert. The Germans also, as I mentioned a moment ago, had to adjust to a wholly unfamiliar environment. They were spread out over vast terrain, which Duroy describes as rugged and very difficult to navigate. The winters were harsh. There was, of course, lots of snow. Every soldier, he writes, had gotten used to wearing snowshoes. And he mentions that we Braunschweigers, always have around 50 Indians with us on patrol, and the German soldiers are racing on snowshoes with the best of them. He is evidently very proud of what these soldiers had accomplished over there in Canada. And he writes to his brother, "You would be filled with admiration for your countrymen." Still, his sense of isolation is intense. Duroy writes that he has no idea when he will be able to return to Germany. He has had no news from Europe, and he does not know what is happening in the war. This was a very common experience, especially for German troops in areas that we would consider remote, like Canada at that time. He also does not know what happened to the many, an estimated 1,800 Braunschweig soldiers who had become American prisoners of war as a result of Burgoyne's surrender at Saratoga in October 1777. His own brother, Anton, is among the captives, but he has not heard anything from or about him. And in fact, he writes to Germany asking if someone from Germany could send him news. He assumes it'd be easier to get news in Germany than it would be in Quebec. Overall, I should mention his impressions of the land was quite positive. In fact, in other records, he described Canada, or Quebec really, the region along the St. Lawrence River, as a kind of simple world, a wilderness, mostly untouched by, as he put it, civilization. Duroy felt as though he was, and he put it, as he explained, seeing nature in his first childhood. He also thought he had never been as healthy in his life as he was now, after he had gotten used to the climate. He hardly drank alcohol, and he was close to quitting smoking tobacco. Indeed, in general, the German troops gradually got used to life in the northernmost province. Duroy eventually returned to Germany, but when it came time for the Corps to leave Canada in the summer of 1783, as many as 700 German soldiers belonging to the Braunschweig Corps were granted permission to remain there. While thousands of German troops were stationed in Canada, largely inactive, a significant number of Germans were prisoners of war including, of course, Dubois' brother Anton, as mentioned. Captivity was a fairly common experience for members of the German troops, of the German Corps. Many spent considerable periods of time in captivity in locations from Massachusetts to Virginia, as well as Spanish Louisiana and Cuba. Indeed, over the course of the war, we estimate that at least 6,000 German soldiers were captured on 5 major occasions alone. Trenton, Christmas 1776, Bennington in the fall of 77, Saratoga, fall of 77, Yorktown, 1781, and then last but not least, the capture of 2 vessels off the coast of New York in September 1779. Document I'm showing you here on the left is an embarkation list that gives a number of troops that were on 6 transports that left New York headed for Canada in 79. On the right is a drawing I mentioned in a second. Throughout the war, the British undertook virtually all of their major troop transports by water as opposed to land. This was a significant disadvantage, as you can imagine. First, it confined sometimes thousands of troops to vessels for extended periods of time, making them unavailable for defensive and offensive actions. Ocean journeys also took a toll on the soldiers, who often arrived at their destination tired, hungry, and sick. On every voyage, soldiers were lost to disease or accident. In addition, the ships carrying troops were easy prey for enemy vessels if they were separated from the fleet. On more than one occasion, the British lost transports to American capers. And the most spectacular of this kind of incident that involved German troops was the capture of the storm-damaged transports Molly and Triton in 79. There were 2 of 6 transports with German troops that were heading from New York to Canada. Many of the passengers had been taken prisoner at Trenton in 1776 and had only recently been released. Note also, and I circled this on the document, that the transport included a significant number of women and children. 39 women and 25 children were on board these transports. Shortly after departure, the fleet sailed into a massive storm. One vessel, the Adamant, was lost. It sunk, drowning more than 200 individuals on board. Others were badly damaged, including the Molly and the Triton. And Hessian officer Andreas Wiederhold, who had been captured at Trenton, recently released, certainly looking forward to being a free man, included drawing of the vessel in his personal diary that is at the University of Pennsylvania now. The rest, you see the storm damage. The vessels, these 2 vessels were drifting about helplessly and, not surprisingly, became very easy prey for American privateers. With their capture by the Americans, the passengers became prisoners of war once again, roughly 2.5 years after Trenton. Still, according to Wiederhold, the men were, and I quote, happy to be off their miserable ships and on God's earth, if America was God's earth. Generally speaking, the Americans treated German prisoners of war fairly well. In most cases, they were allowed to hire themselves out to local farms and businesses, and they often experienced relatively little restrictions on their movement. Many German prisoners were kept in predominantly German regions, such as Lancaster and Reading, Pennsylvania. Desertion was actively encouraged. As already mentioned, the American Congress offered incentives such as liberty and property to German soldiers who left their units and settled in America. Prisoners of war, of course, were, well, literally a captive audience for this kind of propaganda. For the first few years, recruitment into the American military was not officially sanctioned by Congress and the Board of War. That changed after the victory of Yorktown. Beginning in 1782, German captors were generally given the choice of paying a ransom, indenturing themselves, or enlisting in the American military. Here's a record from 1783 that identifies by name some of the Braunschweig soldiers who had enlisted in American units. Most likely, these soldiers were held captive in Reading. It is known that Americans actively recruited around these prisoner of war camps. These individuals had been prisoners of war for a number of years, probably captured at Saratoga, possibly at Bennington in the fall of 1777. And after several years in captivity, they saw enlistment as a way out of captivity. These men enlisted here that are on this particular document in a couple of different Pennsylvania regiments, as well as what is known as Congress's own regiment, which was commanded by Moses Hazen, who, again, we know was in Reading actively recruiting among German prisoners of war. How many German soldiers enlisted in the American military is very challenging to determine. Records are scattered, and some of these men actually returned to their German units at the first opportunity. It seems as though most of the men took the step to escape prolonged captivity and increasingly unfavorable conditions. They did not enlist because they sought to fight for the American cause. Soldiers who had been captured were relatively fortunate, especially compared to soldiers belonging to the Waldeck regiment. We just have a couple of more slides, and I know we're close to time. About 1 year before the capture of the two vessels that I just mentioned, the British launched the Southern Campaign. And in fact, between 1778 and 81, British group transports departed New York for the rebellious colonies in the South on several occasions. Each of these transports included Germans, and one regiment went even further south. They went to West Florida. In late 78, the Waldeck regiment made up more than half of around 1,300 troops that were sent to the capital of West Florida, Pensacola. The province, of course, had remained loyal to the crown. The regiment at the time numbered roughly an estimated 774 individuals, including 35 women and 15 children. It was the only German regiment that was sent that far south, and it was a devastating mission. The Waldeck officer Heldring description of the voyage via Jamaica was published in 79. I showed you a cover a minute ago. And he writes, when the small fleet of transport sailed through the waters of the Gulf of Mexico on New Year's, he could hardly believe it. 3 years previously, in 76, he had celebrated a joyous New Year's in Flanders. Exactly 1 year later, in 1777, he had found himself in winter quarters on another continent, in New Jersey, having a great time. A few days after that, he was captured by the Americans. When 77 turned into 78, he was terribly ill, still a prisoner of war, and here he was now, January 1st, 1779. Another year had gone by, healthy, free, and sailing towards Pensacola. Who would have believed years ago, he wrote, that I would be wandering around this part of the world? And it was an unusual part, different from any part of North America that the troops had, that German troops visited. I'm going to skip over this. I'm running a little short of time. I do want to mention that these troops, this particular the Waldeck regiment, participated in the war against the Spanish. Spain tried to get West Florida back and ultimately succeeded. There was a siege on Pensacola, and that the whole garrison was captured. The Waldeck regiment was actually fairly fortunate, at least the troops that were captured at Pensacola, because the treaty stipulated that these troops would be returned to New York, free passage, courtesy of Spain. And that brings me to the final record. On one of the embarkation lists, we believe that roughly 250 individuals from Waldeck returned to New York. One of the members on one of the passengers on one of the transports was identified as a Black woman. She remains unnamed, which is very typical, unfortunately, for women in these records. Most likely, she was employed by the regiment or an individual officer as a servant. However, the records do not reveal anything else about her other than she was Black and that she was free. And here are my final records. For the duration of the war, German military units in America actively recruited Black men as musicians, labor servants, and in very rare instances also privates. Black men and women also served the regiments in less formal roles, such as personal servants, laborers, and cook. The Braunschweig garrison record, church record that I showed earlier, here I'm bringing it up again, documents the baptism of 5 Black drummers who accompanied the German troops to Germany at the conclusion of the war. The baptisms were sponsored by officers that were veterans of the war, including General Adolf Riedesel, who commanded the Braunschweig Corps in North America. The register also notes that the baptism and confirmation attracted an unusually large crowd. And finally, 4 of the 5 men were born in America and 1 was born in Africa. Imagine for a moment an individual who was kidnapped, enslaved, taken to North America, now made the voyage to Germany as a free man, undoubtedly hoping for a better life. On the left is a muster roll of a Hanau artillery unit that names 4 Black individuals, 1 servant and 3 drummers. The commander of this particular company was Georg Peusch. In the summer of 1781, he reported to his ruler that almost all of the Hessian regiments had hired Black men for various roles, including especially as musicians and laborers. Entirely conventional, consistent with contemporary European views of Blacks in military units, Peusch believed that the addition of Black musicians outfitted in exotic uniforms added considerable prestige to the German companies. It is very challenging to determine whether Blacks ended up with German regiments as voluntary recruits or as plunder. The army routinely seized enslaved people during foraging expeditions, and we have written evidence that Black children were sent to Germany during the war as gifts. Moreover, some of them eventually deserted or were returned to individuals who claimed them as their property. Nevertheless, whether they were attached to German military units voluntarily or involuntarily, whether in formal or informal roles, from the beginning of the German Corps' presence in America, Black men, women, and children were a familiar presence in the encampments. We estimate that at least 200 of them traveled with the German Corps to Germany when the British evacuated the new nation in 1783. So to conclude, an examination of these German authored records, I would say, broadens our understanding of this pivotal period in American history, not least because they include regions that tend to be overlooked in conventional histories of the war, such as Canada and West Florida. It offers fresh and often quite insightful perspectives of the American land, people, customs, and manners, including the prevalence of slavery, regional differences, and also the role of Native Americans. And it offers new interpretations of American and British military and civilian leadership, including suspected motives of the American rebels and the treatment of people deemed disloyal. This was a violent war that had a profound effect on individuals and communities on and off the battlefield in North America and in Europe. Thank you.
Friederike, thank you so much for that presentation. We greatly appreciate you sharing your research. We are out of time, but I wanted to give you the opportunity, if people are interested in learning more about this topic or about the research that you're involved in, where could they go to find that information?
Yes, you can certainly email me through my Penn State account. It's F as in Frank, B as in Boston, the number 10 at psu.edu. I also maintain a website, friederikebaer.com, that is where I share research stories, slides that I've come across, that some of it didn't make it into the book. And that's also a great way to contact me. So I invite anyone who has a question. I know some questions were submitted ahead of time. Please feel free to email me directly. I'd be happy to respond.
Excellent. And we just dropped your email and your website in the chat. So folks who are still hanging around, you can get that information there and then send your questions out to Friederike. We want to thank you for presenting today. We want to thank everyone for Zooming in and for your support of the Penn State Alumni Association. If you're members of the association, thank you for your support. If you're not yet a member, what are you waiting for? Go to our website at alumni.psu.edu, and you too can become a member of the world's largest alumni association. Thank you for tuning in and for all you do for the university, for the glory, and for the future. We are
Penn State. Happy holidays, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in.
Bye-bye.